Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. We're diving into some history we don't talk very much about. I mentioned in a recent stream that I'm going to be taking a look at more ancient history, especially in the build-up to the group trip that I'm hosting to Egypt in March. And that's actually what we're going to dive into today, is some Egyptian history. And the title of this video, it's on the channel Unknown 5. We've done a few of their videos in the past. It's called The First Battle in History, the Battle of Megiddo in 1457 BC. Obviously, we don't know what the first battle in history was or how we even describe that, but obviously history, by written history with written accounts, this could be the oldest battle for which we have a written account. So from that standpoint, it is in fact the first battle in history. Especially interesting to me because it's the Battle of Megiddo, and Megiddo is a real place. We know where it is, and it's got some connections to a word that all of us have heard before, Armageddon. When we think of Armageddon, we think of the big battle at the end of the world. It's described in Revelation, where the big showdown will happen between the kings of the earth at the end of time. And Armageddon actually comes from the Hebrew Har Megiddo, which means hill or mountain of Megiddo. So this is where that battle is said to be taking place at the end of time, the Battle of Armageddon. So it's interesting, the first recorded battle in history we have is fought there. So that's all to say. This should be an interesting topic. It's not one I know a lot about, so I'll be curious to see what I learn and see what we can learn together, and I'll try to offer some feedback and interesting insight where possible. The link is in the description to the original content, and not long after this video goes live, we are having a private stream for our patrons and members today at 3 p.m. Eastern, so check that out if you fall into those categories. Let's dive in.
War is as old as time. For as long as humans have roamed the earth, they have waged war against one another. The unending competition for limited food, shelter, and resources, driving mankind to use force against his neighbors in a harsh world where only the strongest could survive.
It's really not all that different from when we talk about the survival of the fittest, when we talk about evolution, natural selection, things like that. Humans do it too.
In fact, archaeological evidence shows that even before humans created the first civilizations, they were engaged in armed tribal conflicts with rivals.
It probably makes a lot of sense if you think about it. We probably first made weapons to protect ourselves against animals, to hunt animals, and then it was like, oh, these work on animals. I bet they work on each other too.
Ancient, scarred, and broken bones, betraying our eternal thirst for violence in the pursuit of material gain. However, since these prehistoric conflicts predated writing by as much as 7,000 years, no accounts exist which document the struggles and turbulence of our deepest past. It wouldn't be until as recently as 3,500 years ago that the first reliable and detailed account of a battle was recorded. What is now widely viewed as the first battle in history, fought between a young Egyptian pharaoh and a coalition of vassals that had risen up in rebellion against him. Following ancient Egypt's unification around 5,000 years ago, the first pharaoh unleashed his armies upon Canaan, a kingdom in the Levant that encompassed modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. Canaan was a loose confederation of city-states that had grown rich and powerful due to their strategic location along highly lucrative trade routes that bridged Egypt with Mesopotamia and Anatolia.
So you can see why Megiddo, which is going to be kind of in the northern, I guess it'd be kind of the area in here. I don't really know exactly where we're at on the map, but I would think it would be up in this area toward Amuru. It'd be northern modern Israel. You can see why that seems like a natural point for armies. If you have armies coming down from the north toward Egypt, they're not marching over through the desert. They're coming down through this river, through this fertile valley where they can sustain themselves against Egypt. And so this becomes a natural battleground for those things to take place.
And which represented the height of human civilization in the region. The pharaoh coveted these wealth-laden trade routes, and following his successful campaign against Canaan, Egyptians established control over the area, creating several vassal states led by pro-Egyptian puppet kings. The Egyptian Empire now stood as one of the most powerful states in the world. And
it's interesting too to think about this, because as we're getting into this battle, I believe we're talking about Thutmose III. the Pharaoh of Egypt, 1457 BC, falls right near the category of potential theories that people have about a possible exodus, the exodus that's written about in the Bible. If that indeed happened as described, people are trying to figure out when it would have happened. And Tutmosis III's one of the candidates because he fits all the criteria for the Pharaoh that's described in the book of Exodus. And of course, then they're escaping to what is Canaan, and the whole book of Exodus is a description about the Israelite conquest of that land.
Control over vast swathes of the Levant, providing a defensive buffer against rivals, while at the same time generating vast sums for the royal treasury. Yet such profitable lands were also coveted by the other great powers of the Near East, who watched on with envious eyes, the Mitanni and Hittites working tirelessly behind the scenes to stir up unrest and undermine Egyptian influence and authority. Egypt's authority over Canaan gradually eroded over the centuries, and by the time Pharaoh Thutmose II passed away in 1479 BC, whispers of outright rebellion began to spread. Thutmose II's royal wife and half-sister, Hatshepsut, ruled as regent for the late pharaoh's son, Thutmose III, a boy who was born to another queen, and who at just 10 years of age was considered too young to take the throne for himself. Breaking with tradition, Hatshepsut overstepped her authority and essentially became the new pharaoh herself, forcing Thutmose III to impatiently endure a long wait until his stepmother and aunt finally died in 1558 BC.
So it's interesting. I don't know, did he mean 1458? Because he said 1558. I think he probably meant 1458 BC. Interesting to see the parallels between this, where you have situations where a ruler comes along who's too young to rule in their own right, so they have a regent, and that regent wants to hang on to power as long as possible. First one that comes to my mind, and there are lots of examples through all sorts of different kingdoms in history, is King Edward III. His mother and her lover, Roger Mortimer, overthrow Edward II, have him offed in some way, and there's debate about how that went down, and then they rule, and Edward III actually has to do this whole fascinating late night foray into the castle to take his kingdom back. It's fascinating stuff. So it's interesting to see that has been going on for millennia as well.
Some 20 years later, Thutmose III had spent his youth receiving extensive military training from the finest warriors and strategists in the kingdom, this martial upbringing instilling him with a militaristic outlook on the world and an unrelenting desire to restore Egypt to its former glory by forcefully subduing its rivals. The new pharaoh dreamt of leading his armies on the battlefield, his obsession with proving himself to the world, no doubt fueled by having spent so much of his life living under his aunt's shadow. Shortly after being crowned, Thutmose III would be given the perfect opportunity to show exactly what he was made of. Believing the new pharaoh to be inexperienced and weak, the vassal rulers of the Egyptian province of Canaan entered open revolt.
And that's also something that often happens when you have a child king come to the throne who's ruled by other people. As he's seen as weak, it's seen as an opportunity. These vassals, or in later times you have barons and vassals to a king or a lord of some kind, see this as their chance to break free or to take the crown for themselves if possible. So while I'm thinking about this, I should mention too that when I was talking about the theories people have about the Pharaoh of the Exodus, in the case of Thutmose III, we're talking about the Pharaoh that would have been Pharaoh when Moses was born in the Exodus story. It would be then his son, who I think is Amenhotep II, that would be the Pharaoh that has the famous showdown with Moses, where Moses says, "Let my people go," and all that sort of stuff.
Hoping to take advantage of the new pharaoh's transition to power to finally throw off the shackles of Egyptian domination and reassert their independence. Led by the king of the Canaan city of Kadesh, this anti-Egyptian coalition quickly gained support from other regional powers who were keen to use this golden opportunity to strike back at their old rivals. And
So, other than these massive regional powers that you have, like the Hittites, for example, or these big kingdoms like Egypt, most of the other areas are ruled by, they're almost like city-states. They're kings of cities rather than kings of regions or big nation states. And so this guy from Kadesh, being able to unite all of these other cities together, that gives them the weight that they need to be able to fight back. As long as they're fractured, as long as you get some of them to side with Egypt and some against Egypt, you're never going to be able to build the strength to go against them.
check the growing power of Egypt once and for all. The kings of Mitanni and Megiddo threw their lot in with the rebels, the coalition confident in the strength of their mighty city walls and security of their ever-growing numbers. The king of Kadesh assembled the coalition army of some 15,000 warriors at the fortress city of Megiddo and prepared for battle.
See, there's the hill of Megiddo, which is Har-Mageddon. Or Har-Megiddo, which is Armageddon, I guess, probably in Greek.
The city of Megiddo was perhaps the most strategically important and easily defensible location in Canaan. It dominated the main trade route between Egypt and Mesopotamia, and its imposing fortifications overlooked a fertile valley that was ideal for supplying and sustaining a large army. The odds were certainly against the new pharaoh Thutmose III, however losing such a valuable possession was simply unthinkable. Megiddo had to be retaken if the rebellion was to be crushed. Thutmose III showed no hesitation and sprung into action, personally leading his army of between 10 and 20,000 men and chariots against the rebel forces.
So, on paper, thinking about this, 10 to 20,000 men and chariots. Chariots are key because that's a big plus on the battlefield. These are your tanks of the day. But you're going up against these city-states that have about 15,000 combined, and they're going to be behind city walls, and in many cases, like Megiddo, on a hill. 10 to 20,000 ain't going to be enough to take a bunch of cities that way, unless they're all scattered and you can focus on one at a time.
Departing Thebes, the Egyptians made the grueling 150-mile, 10-day march to Yehem, where a critical decision awaited the young pharaoh. From Yehem, there were only 3 paths the Egyptian army could take to Megiddo. Both the northern and southern routes were relatively safe for his army to pass through, however they were indirect and would add days to the march, losing valuable time and giving the rebels longer to prepare their defences. The central route was far shorter, however it snaked through a narrow mountain ravine that would
Narrow mountain ravines, that's exactly the kind of scenario that you can defeat a larger force with a smaller one by holding a pass against much bigger numbers because you can stack them up behind you.
required the army to march in a single file formation, resulting in the vanguard reaching the plain in front of Megiddo, while the rest of the army was still marching through the ravine. If the rebels blocked the central pass exit, they could destroy the thinly stretched Egyptian army as it emerged piece by piece,
This is what happened to the Romans at a place like Teutoburg Forest many centuries later, where they're strung out. They're a more powerful force, but they're strung out in the woods, and you're able to bottle them up and defeat them.
than having to face its full might head-on. Thutmose summoned his war council for guidance. The senior generals present unanimously agreed that the central pass was simply too dangerous to consider. The ambush they would almost certainly face at the route's exit, sure to result in the destruction of the entire Egyptian army.
Wise.
Yet,
It's good that he, number one, is willing to listen to his generals. Number two, that they feel confident enough to speak the truth in this situation.
Thutmose refused to listen to his more experienced advisors, concluding that if his own seasoned generals were advising him to take one of the easier routes, then the enemy's generals would anticipate such a decision. For surely no sane strategist would dare risk everything by taking the dangerous central pass.
So now the thinking game begins. This is like the scene with the poison in Princess Bride, where, well, this is what I would do if I were in that situation. But then, of course, if I were in that situation, I would think that that's what I was going to do. And so now I'm not going to do that. And there's all these mind games going on. Who's going to guess right? Who's going to outwit the other one? Who's going to make the choice that's going to make the difference?
He decided that the best strategy was to do the unexpected. The pharaoh would gamble everything and lead his men through the risky central pass.
Go big or go home.
As the pass was so narrow, the Egyptian chariots had to be dismantled and carried by the soldiers.
That's not
the
good.
men marching in single file as they passed through the tight ravine, dreading what lay ahead and expecting the route's end to result in their certain death.
You would not want to be the first 100 guys in that line.
Yet the pharaoh's gamble paid off. The rebels were certain that the Egyptian army would take one of the other safer paths, and had thus dispatched a large portion of their army to block both the northern and southern routes.
It's fascinating seeing all this, especially after going through a series talking about Napoleon. And yes, Napoleon's Marshals is coming really soon. Because this is the same kind of stuff going on in the Napoleonic Wars, where Napoleon's splitting his force and covering all the possible places that the enemy could come. And once he makes contact, trying to quickly get the rest of his forces over to that same place.
Leaving the central pass woefully undefended, the pharaoh and his forces easily destroying the handful of scouts camped at the route's exit. Caught by surprise, the king of Kadesh rushed to assemble what remained of his forces on the plain in front of the city of Megiddo. However, the once mighty coalition army he had earlier gathered was now a heavily depleted shell of its former glory. His decision to split his army and block just two of the routes now coming back to haunt him as the pharaoh's army descended upon the city. With the path to Megiddo open, the pharaoh gave his enemies no time to prepare, rushing forward and setting up camp just outside the fortress of Megiddo.
So we had to know that this was going to end up in an Egyptian victory, because I doubt Pharaoh would have commissioned any works that have survived to this day that would tell us the story of the battle if it had been a horrifying defeat.
Outmaneuvered and now in disarray, the rebel army didn't have enough time to position themselves well enough to take advantage of the high ground outside the city. The battle that would decide the fate of Canaan was about to begin. The pharaoh arranged his army in a concave formation consisting of 3 divisions, using the 2 wings to enclose the rebel army and threaten their flanks, while
It's amazing we know this much detail about this battle.
Thutmose personally led the center division forward against the enemy. The speed, size, and ferocity of the Egyptian attack stunned the rebels and utterly smashed their will to resist. And as news of the swift collapse of the left wing cascaded through the rebel army, the lines buckled and broke into a rout as
It's fascinating. You can even see like images of the walls. You can see a ladder there. It's so cool. I cannot wait to see some of this stuff in person.
panic and fear ran rampant. Those who could fled into the city of Megiddo, the terrified men promptly closing the gates behind them in a desperate attempt to keep the pursuing Egyptians out. However, the selfish panic left large numbers of their own men stranded on the battlefield outside.
Yep.
A testament to just how swift and utterly complete the rout Thutmose inflicted on the rebels can be seen in the low number of casualties inflicted, with just 83 hands said to have been cut from the dead as trophies. While the true number of casualties would have been higher, the fact that only 83 of these grisly trophies were taken points to the battle being a relatively bloodless affair. The ancient Egyptian record of the battle further amplifies this point, stating that the enemy fled within the walls of Megiddo upon seeing the pharaoh leading his army against them, their faces described as being full of fear.
I mean, just those little details like that. And again, like anything in history, we have to take all this with a grain of salt, and we have to look at what lens this is being viewed through. And obviously this is being celebrated as a great Egyptian victory for Thutmose III and his army. So they're the ones telling the story. Obviously, they're going to put the best possible spin on it.
Such minimal resistance from the rebels is hardly surprising. Facing a much larger Egyptian force than anticipated, taken by surprise by the pharaoh's unexpected and sudden arrival through the central ravine, and with a large number of their own men still miles away, even the kings of Kadesh and Megiddo are said to have ran for their lives. However, like thousands of the men they commanded, they found the gates to Megiddo firmly shut. The total destruction of the rebel army was now within reach. However, this golden opportunity to smash the rebellion once and for all was squandered, as seduced by the sight of the hastily abandoned rebel treasures strewn across the battlefield, the Egyptian soldiers halted their pursuit of the enemy and set about gathering as much plunder as they could carry.
You can see all the hands there in that image. This is how armies operated, though, at the time. This is one of the main motivations for a soldier to fight, is the potential for loot if you win. Loot from the bodies of the soldiers, but loot from a town if you conquer that. And that was often how armies got paid and then got rewarded for their hard-earned victories,
allowing the remainder of the scattered rebel army to escape to safety. The undignified manner in which the kings of Kadesh and Megiddo were able to escape along with the remainder of their beaten army is recorded in great detail by the Egyptians. These men who had just minutes ago dreamt of becoming independent kings in their own right, now reduced to being hoisted up and over the city's walls by its inhabitants, using improvised ropes made from items of clothing that had been tied together. The sight of them dangling precariously in midair, no doubt providing the watching Egyptians with much amusement.
The detail's incredible, and the fact that they put all this in stone so that it lasted these last 3,500 years, love it.
With the main bulk of the Canaan army now safely inside Megiddo, instead of attempting to breach the city walls and capture the city, Thutmose opted to lay siege, the young king once again demonstrating wisdom beyond his years, as he no doubt understood that no preparations for a siege had been made by the rebels, and as such the city was woefully low on supplies with which to feed the large army now residing within its walls.
Incredible.
Instead of wasting the lives of his soldiers on a costly, all-out attack, he would patiently allow hunger to win the siege for him. The city was carefully surrounded by defensive earthworks and enclosed within a wooden palisade, ensuring that nobody could escape. After several months of slow starvation, the rebels surrendered and prepared to accept the pharaoh's judgment, no doubt certain that their lives would be forfeit.
And we've talked about this before, but if you're new to the channel, that's what happens in a siege. If you surrender right away, you're often treated humanely. If you put up a fight and you hold out and make an army besiege you for months, you can expect that when the time comes that they do get into the city, they're going to loot and pillage and burn and do the R word and all the other things that happen in situations like this.
However, in an act of generous mercy, Thutmose spared everyone in the city, so long as they promised to never again raise their swords in rebellion. The ringleader...
So there's a propaganda value to this as well, right? Look at how gracious Thutmose III was in victory. He didn't destroy the city. Just stay loyal to him, and this won't happen to you. Or if you're a city that gets besieged because you rebelled, maybe the best option is to surrender, because see how well he may treat you.
Leaders were stripped of their positions, with new, more loyal officials appointed in their place, their children taken back to Egypt as hostages to ensure that they would not be tempted to break their word in future. The shrewd pharaoh ensuring that these children were given an Egyptian education and essentially indoctrinated to embrace Egyptian culture and thus grow into loyal adults. The Egyptian victory at Megiddo solidified the pharaoh's control over the entire region and its lucrative trade routes, as rebel state after rebel state surrendered, Thutmose III's reign ultimately seeing the Egyptian empire reach its greatest expanse. While the battle fought at Megiddo was relatively unremarkable in the way it unfolded, what made it unique was its documentation. Thutmose III brought his personal scribe with him on campaign.
This guy, this is such a a modern way of thinking. I shouldn't say modern, but the last couple of thousand years. I mean, think of Julius Caesar. He's writing down everything that's happening because he knows it's going to be passed down and other people are going to hear about it. Tutmosis the third's doing the same thing. Bring along the scribe. It's basically his own personal war correspondent to tell the story of what happened. I love it.
The account of the pharaoh's victory taken from the meticulous journal the scribe wrote, eventually being carved into the walls of the Temple of Amun in Karnak, the ancient stones preserving the tale of what was the first recorded battle in human history.
Now I'm excited because I'm going to the temple at Karnak in March when we're there, so I'm going to have to make sure that I see this.
One that would set the standard for the many battles to come in the centuries that followed.
Love that. That was a really cool story. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know your thoughts. I know some of you are passionate about ancient Egyptian history, and you know so much more about this time period and what was going on with guys like Tutmosis III, his son Amenhotep II, and others. Let me know in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.